My husband always had one rule. No matter what happened to him, I was never to open his old toolbox. Not after his death. Not if I was lonely. Not if I needed money. Not even if someone else asked me to. He never explained why. And after 43 years of marriage, I had learned that when Thomas spoke with that quiet certainty, there was usually a reason behind it. So when cancer took him 15 years ago, I honored his final request without hesitation. I placed the old steel toolbox on the highest shelf in the back corner of his workshop, exactly where he had left it. I locked the workshop, kept the key, and every year on the anniversary of his passing, I walked inside, dusted the shelves, cleaned his workbench, watered the climbing roses outside the window. But I never touched the box. People often asked why I kept an old workshop that nobody used anymore. I always smiled and said it reminded me of him. That wasn't entirely true. The workshop wasn't just full of memories. It was full of questions. Sometimes, while sweeping the floor, I'd catch myself staring at that rusted toolbox. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't valuable. It wasn't even particularly large. Just scratched blue steel covered with years of faded paint and tiny rust spots. The kind of toolbox every mechanic owned 50 years ago. Somehow, it always felt heavier than metal, as if it carried something much larger than its own weight. Our son Mark once offered to throw it away. "Mom," he laughed, "Dad probably left nothing but old wrenches in there." I refused before he even finished speaking. He looked surprised. I think that was the first time he realized I was serious about keeping my promise. Years passed. Neighbors moved away. Grandchildren grew up. The workshop slowly became another forgotten room on the property. The roof creaked during storms. The wooden walls faded. Dust gathered over every surface. Only the toolbox remained exactly where Thomas had left it, waiting. Sometimes I dreamed about it. In those dreams, Thomas never spoke. He simply stood beside the workbench, looking toward the shelf. Not angry, not smiling, just watching. I'd wake before sunrise with that image still lingering in my mind. I always convinced myself it meant nothing. Grief has strange ways of visiting us. Then came the spring everything changed. It began with a violent thunderstorm. The strongest we'd seen in decades. Rain hammered the roof all night. Wind ripped branches from the old maple trees. By morning, part of the workshop ceiling had collapsed. I stood outside staring at the damage, feeling as though I had failed him. For 15 years I had protected that room. Now nature had forced its way inside. The insurance company said the building wasn't safe. The contractor said they would need to remove everything before repairs could begin. Everything, including the toolbox. I told them no. They shrugged. "If you don't empty it yourself, ma'am, we'll have to." That sentence stayed with me all night. For 15 years I had obeyed my husband. But now, if strangers opened it instead, wouldn't that be breaking his wish even more? For the first time since his funeral, I found myself holding the old brass key to the workshop with trembling hands. And deep inside, a question I had buried for 15 long years finally refused to stay silent. What could possibly be inside one simple toolbox that was worth protecting even after death? The morning after the storm, I stood in front of Thomas's workshop longer than I cared to admit. Part of the roof had collapsed near the back wall, leaving broken beams hanging like old bones. Rainwater had soaked the wooden floor, and the familiar scent of sawdust had been replaced by damp earth and wet timber. For 15 years, I had managed to preserve that little building exactly as he left it. Overnight, nature had undone what time had respected. The contractor arrived just after 8 with 2 younger workers. They walked around the building, taking measurements and quietly discussing what needed to be replaced. One of them looked through the broken section of the roof and whistled softly. "We'll have to clear everything out before we start," he said. "It's not safe to leave anything inside." I nodded politely, but my eyes drifted toward the shelf in the far corner. Even from outside, I knew exactly where the toolbox sat. Hidden beneath a layer of dust and shadows, untouched since the day I carried it there after the funeral. I suddenly realized that, unless I acted first, strangers would soon place their hands on the one object Thomas had forbidden anyone to open. That afternoon, after they left, I carried an old folding chair into the workshop and sat in silence. The room felt strangely alive despite the damage. Every tool hanging on the wall reminded me of his careful hands. Every scratch on the workbench told a story I still remembered. The vise near the window had repaired bicycles for neighborhood children. The old drill press had built birdhouses for our grandchildren. Even the cracked coffee mug resting on the shelf still carried the faint stain from the mornings we spent together. Thomas had never been a wealthy man. He worked with his hands his entire life, fixing tractors, restoring antique furniture, repairing anything people thought was beyond saving. He always believed that if something could still serve a purpose, it deserved another chance. Perhaps that was why people trusted him so deeply. They didn't just bring him broken machines. They brought him broken lives. I smiled as I remembered how neighbors often stayed long after their repairs were finished, sitting on overturned buckets while Thomas listened more than he spoke. Somehow people always left lighter than they arrived. He possessed that rare gift of making others feel understood without offering complicated advice. Sometimes I wondered if that was the greatest thing he ever built. As evening approached, golden sunlight filtered through the broken roof. It landed directly on the old toolbox, illuminating it for the first time in years. The faded blue paint looked even older now, chipped away around the edges where decades of work had worn through the metal. The leather handle had darkened with age, yet it somehow remained intact. It looked ordinary, completely ordinary, which only made the mystery harder to understand. I stood before the shelf and stretched out my hand. My fingertips stopped inches from the cold metal. My heart began pounding so loudly that I could hear it inside the quiet workshop. Then I pulled my hand back. "No," I whispered to myself. "Not today." Instead, I locked the workshop once more and returned to the house. That night, sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Thomas sitting at his workbench, quietly polishing one of his old chisels. I could almost hear the scrape of the sharpening stone against steel. Then, without looking at me, he spoke exactly as he had 15 years earlier. "Promise me one thing. Only one thing. Not the house. Not the money. Not the land. Just the toolbox." I remembered that conversation more clearly than any other moment of his final weeks. It had happened 3 days before he died. The hospital room was almost silent except for the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. He had grown terribly thin, yet his eyes remained as calm as ever. When he asked everyone else to leave the room, I assumed he wanted to tell me where important documents were hidden or explain how to manage the finances after he was gone. Instead, he reached for my hand. "There's an old toolbox in the workshop." I smiled gently. "I know the one." His fingers tightened around mine. "Never open it." I laughed softly, thinking he was teasing me. "I'm serious." The smile disappeared from his face. "No matter how difficult life becomes. Promise me." I asked him why. He slowly shook his head. "If I explain, you'll spend the rest of your life waiting for the right moment." Frowned, confused. "But if I don't explain, you'll simply keep your promise." Even then, I wanted to ask more questions. But something in his expression stopped me. So I promised. He closed his eyes with visible relief. And we never spoke about the toolbox again. The next morning, I found myself making coffee much earlier than usual. The house felt unusually quiet, as though it too were waiting for a decision. For 15 years I had lived peacefully with unanswered questions. Now that peace had disappeared overnight, I carried my mug to the kitchen window, where I could see the workshop across the yard. Morning fog drifted between the trees, wrapping the old building in a pale gray veil. It almost looked abandoned, yet I knew every corner inside by heart. I had spent nearly half my life watching Thomas disappear into that workshop before sunrise and return only after supper, smelling of cedar, machine oil, and fresh-cut wood. People often joked that I had lost my husband to that little building. The truth was quite the opposite. That workshop had given him purpose. And purpose had given him life. When Thomas retired from the repair shop in town, many people expected him to slow down. Instead, he became busier than ever. Farmers brought him broken tools. Young couples asked him to build nursery furniture. Widows came with old rocking chairs that belonged to their late husbands. Somehow, nothing ever left his hands without looking better than before. He charged very little, sometimes nothing at all. I used to tease him that we would never become rich. He would simply smile. "We already are." At the time I thought he meant our family. Now I wondered whether he had meant something entirely different. Late that afternoon, our son Mark stopped by after work. He parked his pickup beside the barn and immediately noticed the damaged roof. "Mom, that's worse than I expected." "It is. They'll need to rebuild almost half of it." "I know." He looked toward the open workshop door. "I can help move everything this weekend." My stomach tightened. "No." He looked surprised. "You don't have to do it alone." I said no. The words came out sharper than I intended. For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally I sighed. "I'm sorry." He shrugged. "I've never understood why you won't let anyone touch Dad's things." I looked down at my hands. "It isn't everything. It's just that old toolbox, isn't it?" I didn't answer. Mark laughed quietly. "You know, when I was 12, I tried opening it." That sentence hit me like cold water. "You what?" "I couldn't." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "It was locked." Locked. I had never even considered that possibility. For 15 years, I had assumed I simply hadn't opened it because of my promise. I had never checked whether it could even be opened. "I remember asking Dad where the key was," Mark continued. He smiled and said, "Some things stay closed because they're finished." Finished. The word echoed in my mind long after Mark stopped speaking. Not hidden. Not dangerous. Finished. There was a difference. Or perhaps there wasn't. After Mark left, I walked back toward the workshop carrying an old flashlight. Evening shadows stretched across the floor, and the silence inside felt heavier than usual. I climbed the small wooden stool beside the shelf and gently lifted the toolbox for the first time in 15 years. It surprised me immediately. It was far heavier than I remembered. Not impossibly heavy. Just heavier than a box filled with ordinary hand tools should have been. I carried it carefully to the workbench where Thomas had spent thousands of hours repairing other people's lives, one broken object at a time. Dust covered the lid so thickly that my fingertips left clean lines across the faded blue paint. For several minutes I simply looked at it. The metal latch was covered with rust. Then I noticed something I had somehow missed all these years. There really was a lock. A tiny brass lock built directly into the latch. I leaned closer. The keyhole was almost invisible beneath years of dust. My heart began beating faster. Thomas hadn't merely asked me not to open it. He had physically made sure nobody could. Slowly I turned the toolbox around. Perhaps the key was taped underneath. Perhaps hidden inside the handle. Perhaps somewhere obvious that I had overlooked. Nothing. Every inch looked untouched. I searched the drawers beneath the workbench. Old nails. Measuring tapes. Sandpaper. Rusty screws. Receipts from hardware stores that no longer existed. But no key. As darkness settled outside, I sat alone in Thomas's chair, staring at the silent box. For the first time I realized something that had never occurred to me before. Thomas had locked it. He had also hidden the key. The search for the key became part of my daily routine without my even realizing it. Every morning, after feeding the birds and watering the roses Thomas had planted years before, I found myself drifting toward the workshop with a quiet sense of purpose. I wasn't trying to break my promise anymore. At least that's what I kept telling myself. I was only looking for something my husband had chosen to leave behind. Thomas had never been careless. If he hid a key, he hid it with intention. That thought comforted me in an odd way. He hadn't expected someone to force the toolbox open. He had expected someone, perhaps only one person, to eventually find the key. Otherwise, why keep the lock at all? The workshop slowly became less like a museum and more like a puzzle waiting to be solved. I opened cabinets that hadn't been touched in years. I emptied rusty coffee cans filled with old screws. I unfolded yellowed instruction manuals from machines we no longer owned. Every drawer seemed to contain another piece of Thomas's life, carefully preserved beneath layers of dust. One afternoon I discovered dozens of handwritten notes tucked inside a wooden cabinet. Most were nothing more than measurements or shopping lists. Replace bearings. Sharpen chisels. Call Mr. Henderson about the tractor. Simple reminders from an ordinary man. Yet seeing his handwriting again made my chest tighten. I sat on the workshop floor reading every scrap of paper as though each one might somehow bring him back for a few more minutes. Near the bottom of the pile, I found an envelope with my name written across the front. My hands immediately began to tremble. I turned it over. It wasn't sealed. Inside was only a folded grocery receipt from nearly 20 years ago. On the back, Thomas had scribbled a single sentence. If something matters, you'll always come back to it. I smiled despite myself. Sounded exactly like him. He had a way of saying ordinary things that stayed with people for years. I slipped the receipt into my sweater pocket instead of putting it back. For reasons I couldn't explain, it felt important. The following Sunday, our granddaughter Emily came to visit. She was 23 now, studying architecture in another state, but whenever she came home, she always insisted on walking around the property with me. She loved hearing stories about her grandfather. I wish I had been older, she said as we stood outside the workshop. I barely remember him. You remember more than you think. She smiled. I remember him teaching me how to hold a hammer. I laughed. You were 5. I know. He said the hammer should never do all the thinking. And blinked. He told you that. She nodded. He said tools only obey the hands holding them. I looked toward the workshop door. Thomas had said that hundreds of times. I'd heard it so often that I'd forgotten how unusual it sounded. Emily noticed my expression. What is it? Nothing. But it wasn't nothing. It reminded me that Thomas believed every object carried a purpose far beyond its appearance. Perhaps that old toolbox wasn't important because of what it contained. Perhaps it mattered because of what it represented. Later that afternoon, Emily wandered through the workshop while I dusted shelves. She paused beside the old workbench. Grandma. Yes. Did Grandpa always keep this drawer locked? I looked up. What drawer? She pointed beneath the center of the bench. I frowned. There isn't a locked drawer. There is. I walked over. She was right. Hidden beneath years of grime was a narrow drawer I had completely forgotten existed. It blended almost perfectly into the front of the workbench. Pulled gently. It refused to move. My heartbeat quickened. In 43 years of marriage, I had never once opened that drawer. Not because Thomas had forbidden me. Because I had never even noticed it. Emily stepped back. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have touched anything. No. I whispered. You may have just found something I've been looking for. After she left, I knelt in front of the workbench with a flashlight. The lock was tiny. Older than the one on the toolbox. Its brass surface had darkened almost black with age. For a long moment I simply stared at it. Then I noticed something carved into the wood just beneath the drawer. The carving was almost invisible beneath decades of scratches. Only 3 tiny letters. Thomas Edward Morgan. His initials. Well, not quite. There should have been another letter. His full initials were TMW. Thomas Edward Morgan Williams. One letter was missing. And suddenly, for the first time, I began to wonder if Thomas hadn't carved his initials at all. He had left me the beginning of a clue. I barely slept that night. The carved letters stayed in my mind long after I turned off the bedroom light. T-E-M. 3 letters that should have been 4. Thomas was far too careful to make a mistake like that. Every shelf in his workshop had been labeled with perfect handwriting. Every jar of screws had its own place. Even his old notebooks were organized by year. If one letter was missing, had been left out on purpose. The following morning, I returned to the workshop carrying nothing but a notebook and a pencil. I decided to stop thinking like Thomas's wife and start thinking like the man himself. When he repaired something, he never attacked the problem immediately. He observed first. He believed answers revealed themselves to patient eyes. So I sat quietly in his chair. For nearly an hour I simply looked around. The sunlight entered through the broken roof differently than it had before the storm. Dust floated lazily through the beams of light, settling over shelves that had remained untouched for years. Nothing seemed unusual, until I looked at the wall behind the workbench. Hundreds of tools still hung exactly where Thomas had left them. Each outline had been carefully painted onto the pegboard decades earlier, making it obvious where every hammer, wrench, and screwdriver belonged. One empty space immediately caught my attention. A narrow outline, long, thin. No tool occupied it. It stood. Slowly, I walked closer. The paint around that empty outline was noticeably cleaner than the surrounding wood. Something had hung there for years, then disappeared. Not recently. Long before Thomas died. I searched every drawer, every cabinet, every shelf. The missing tool wasn't anywhere inside the workshop. That didn't make sense. Thomas hated incomplete sets. He often joked that missing tools irritated him more than broken ones. So why would he leave an empty space untouched? The missing object wasn't a tool anymore. As I examined the painted outline more carefully, I realized something unexpected. It wasn't shaped like a screwdriver or a chisel. It resembled a very long key. I felt a chill run across my arms. Could the outline itself be showing me what I was searching for? I measured it with an old ruler lying on the bench. 7 inches long. Far longer than the tiny keyhole on the toolbox required. Too long for the drawer as well. It couldn't be the key itself, but perhaps it belonged to something that held the key. That afternoon I climbed into the attic above the workshop for the first time in over a decade. The wooden stairs groaned beneath my weight. Dust coated everything. Old fishing poles. Broken window frames. Boxes filled with Christmas decorations we no longer used. Near the far corner sat an old wooden chest I hadn't seen since Thomas retired. Inside were dozens of forgotten objects from another lifetime. His military photographs, our first camping lantern, Emily's wooden rocking horse, bundles of letters tied together with faded ribbon. Beneath an old wool blanket, found a leather tool roll. My breath caught. Thomas used that roll every day when we were first married. He carried it from house to house repairing clocks, doors, cabinets, anything people asked him to fix. I carefully untied the worn leather straps. Most of the pockets were empty, except one. A single narrow compartment still held something wrapped in soft cloth. For a moment I couldn't move. 15 years of questions had led me to one forgotten bundle. I unfolded the cloth. Inside rested not a key, but an old brass measuring gauge unlike anything I had ever seen. Its handle matched the exact outline on the workshop wall. On one side, Thomas had engraved 4 tiny words. Not everything is measured. He frowned. It wasn't a message he would normally write. Thomas measured everything. Angles, distances. Precision was his life. So why would he write the opposite? I turned the gauge over. Tiny scratches covered the back. First they looked random. Then I noticed they formed a pattern. Small marks, grouped into rows. Like directions. Someone else might have dismissed them as years of wear. But I had lived with Thomas long enough to recognize one undeniable truth. He never scratched metal by accident. Every mark had a reason. Somehow, I knew I had just uncovered the first real clue he had been waiting 15 years for me to find. I carried the brass gauge into the house as carefully as though it were made of glass. Not because it looked valuable, didn't. The brass had darkened over the years, and one corner was slightly bent from decades of use. To anyone else, it would have seemed like another forgotten tool from a retired carpenter's collection. But Thomas had hidden it. That alone made it different. I placed it on the dining room table beneath the afternoon sunlight and studied every inch of it. The engraving still troubled me. Not everything is measured. Sounded almost philosophical. Thomas wasn't a philosopher. He believed in practical answers. When something broke, he repaired it. When something didn't fit, he reshaped it. He rarely spoke in riddles. Which meant those words weren't meant to confuse me. They were meant to redirect me. I wasn't supposed to measure the object. I was supposed to measure something else. I reached for my reading glasses and examined the tiny scratches covering the back once more. This time, I noticed they weren't random lines at all. They formed groups. 3 short marks. A longer one. Another 3. Then a gap. The same pattern repeated again and again. It reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. I opened one of Thomas's old notebooks, hoping to find similar markings. Instead, I found pages filled with measurements from projects completed decades earlier. Cabinet dimensions, door frames, furniture sketches. Everything was written with his usual neat handwriting, except for the final pages. Those contained almost no words, only symbols, tiny lines, small circles, arrows. At first glance they looked meaningless. Then I suddenly laughed. I know this. It was our old garden map. Nearly 30 years earlier, Thomas had designed every flower bed and fruit tree on the property using simple symbols instead of labels. 3 short lines represented apple trees. A circle marked the old well. Arrows showed irrigation channels. The scratches on the brass gauge weren't writing. They were a map. But a map of what? I hurried back to the workshop. Standing in the center of the room, I slowly turned the gauge in my hands while comparing the scratches to everything around me. Workbench, window, shelves, pegboard. Nothing matched. Then I looked down. The floor. The workshop floor had been rebuilt twice during our marriage. Only one section remained original. The area directly beneath Thomas's workbench. Old oak boards, darkened with decades of oil and sawdust. I knelt carefully. For years I had walked across those boards without paying attention. Now I noticed something unusual. One plank near the wall carried 3 tiny nail heads arranged differently from all the others. Exactly like the first group of scratches on the gauge. My pulse quickened. I brushed away years of dust with my sleeve. The wood looked perfectly ordinary. No handles, no hinges, no visible opening. Oh, Thomas had taught me something many years ago. If you can't see how something opens, it probably wasn't meant to open from above. I frowned. Above. I crawled underneath the workbench. Cobwebs clung to the old support beams. It was cramped and dark, forcing me to use the flashlight between my teeth. The underside of the floorboards looked just as old as the rest of the building, until the beam nearest the wall caught my attention. Someone had carved a tiny arrow into it, no larger than my thumbnail, pointing upward. Had to be. He never marked wood without reason. I reached upward and pressed against the board directly above the arrow. Nothing happened. I pushed harder. Still nothing. Then I remembered something else. Thomas always hated forcing old wood. Pressure isn't the answer. Direction is. Instead of pushing, I slid my hand sideways. A soft click echoed beneath the workshop. Froze. Fully. The floorboard shifted less than half an inch. Hidden so perfectly that 15 years of sweeping, mopping, and walking across it had never revealed its secret. My breathing became shallow. Carefully, I lifted the narrow oak plank. Beneath it rested a small metal compartment built directly into the foundation. Inside lay only 3 objects. An old silver pocket watch. A folded envelope. Tiny brass key. Not large. Not ornate. Just small enough to fit the lock on Thomas's toolbox. For 15 years, the key had been beneath my feet every single day. For several long seconds, I couldn't bring myself to touch the key. It rested inside the hidden compartment exactly where Thomas had placed it, as though 15 years had passed in the blink of an eye. The brass had darkened with age, but its teeth were clean, almost polished. He must have held it countless times before deciding to hide it beneath the workshop floor. I reached for the pocket watch first. The silver case felt cold in my hands. When I pressed the tiny latch, the cover opened with surprising ease. Inside was a photograph no larger than a postage stamp. It showed Thomas as a young man standing beside another man I had never seen before. Both were smiling. Both wore heavy work aprons. On the inside cover, engraved in delicate script, were 6 simple words. Brothers are chosen more than born. I frowned. Thomas didn't have a brother. He had been an only child. At least, that was what I had believed for over 40 years. My eyes shifted to the folded envelope lying beside the watch. Across the front, in Thomas's unmistakable handwriting, were only 3 words. For after me. Not for Mary. Not open immediately. Simply. For after me. I turned it over. The seal had never been broken. My fingers instinctively moved toward the edge. Then I stopped. Oh. This wasn't what he had asked me not to open. His promise had been about the toolbox, not the envelope. Oh. Something inside me whispered that the letter and the toolbox belonged together. I carefully slipped the envelope back into the compartment. The only object remaining was the tiny brass key. Picked it up. It weighed almost nothing. Yet in that moment, it felt heavier than the toolbox itself. For 15 years I had imagined this exact moment. Sometimes with fear. Sometimes with excitement. Sometimes with guilt. Now that it had finally arrived, I felt none of those things. Only calm. Strange, peaceful certainty. As though Thomas had been quietly leading me here all along. I carried the key to the workbench. The toolbox waited exactly where I had left it. Dust still covered its faded blue lid. The old latch looked unchanged. Everything around me fell silent. Even the birds outside seemed to disappear. My hands trembled as I inserted the key into the tiny lock. Slid in perfectly. Of course it did. I wrapped my fingers around the key. Then stopped. Not yet. Instead I closed my eyes. I kept my promise, I whispered. The words surprised me. I hadn't planned to say them. I waited 15 years. I never opened it. I hope that was enough. The workshop answered with silence. A warm breeze drifted through the broken section of the roof, carrying with it the scent of fresh rain and old cedar. For the first time since Thomas died, the room no longer felt heavy. Felt complete. Slowly, I turned the key. A soft metallic click echoed across the workshop. The lock was open. I stared at the latch for several moments. Nothing else happened. No hidden mechanism. No dramatic sound. Just an old toolbox waiting to be opened. Somehow, lifting the lid felt far more difficult than unlocking it. Because once I looked inside, there would be no returning to 15 years of wondering. I placed both hands on the lid, took one slow breath, and lifted it. The hinges creaked softly. There were no gold coins, no stacks of money, no secret government documents, no jewels, no hidden fortune. Everything inside had been arranged with extraordinary care. Every tool rested in its own perfectly fitted place. Old wrenches, wood chisels, a wooden-handled hammer polished smooth by decades of use, tiny oil can, several screwdrivers, each one cleaned, each one wrapped in soft cloth. It looked less like a toolbox, and more like a memorial. I felt an unexpected wave of disappointment. Was that really all? Had I spent 15 years protecting ordinary tools? Then I noticed something unusual. The bottom of the toolbox seemed far too shallow. The tools couldn't possibly require that much depth. I carefully lifted the tray holding them. Came out easily. Beneath it, hidden in a perfectly built false bottom, lay a single leather-bound journal. And resting on top of it, Another envelope. This one carried my name. Not for after me. Not someday. Only one word. Mary. I stared at my name for what felt like an eternity. Mary. Nothing more. No date. No explanation. Just my name, written in Thomas's steady handwriting with the same fountain pen he had used for decades. My fingers hovered over the envelope, but I didn't touch it immediately. Instead, I picked up the leather journal beneath it. Its cover was worn smooth, the corners softened by years of handling. Unlike every other notebook Thomas owned, this one carried no label, no year, no project, no title, only plain brown leather. I opened the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably his. But the first sentence made my heart stop. If you're reading this, then you kept your promise. A tear rolled down my cheek before I realized I was crying. Of all the possibilities I had imagined over 15 years, I had never imagined that Thomas had expected me to succeed. Not hope. Expected. I continued reading. I knew you would wait. I also knew life would eventually force your hand. That is why I never told you when to open the toolbox. It wasn't the years that mattered. It was the reason. I lowered the journal into my lap. Reason. He hadn't wanted the box to stay closed forever. He had wanted it opened at the right moment. Kept reading. If curiosity brought you here, you opened it too early. If greed brought you here, you opened it for the wrong reason. But if circumstances beyond your control finally left you no other choice, then you're exactly where I hoped you would be. Covered my mouth. It was as though Thomas had been sitting across from me all along. He knew me better than I knew myself. He understood that I would never break my promise willingly. The storm. The damaged roof. The contractors. Without realizing it, every event had led me here exactly as he had predicted. I turned another page. The next entry wasn't about the toolbox at all. It was about us. Thomas wrote about the day we first met at the county fair. He admitted that he had walked past my family's bakery 3 times before gathering enough courage to buy a loaf of bread he didn't actually need. He confessed that he deliberately damaged the hinge on his own front gate so he could invent an excuse to walk past my house again. I laughed through my tears. You ridiculous man. Some stories were completely new to me. Others I had heard dozens of times. Yet somehow, seeing them written in his own words made them feel brand new. Several pages later, the journal changed. The memories disappeared. The tone became serious. If you've reached this page, then you've probably found the pocket watch. I instinctively looked toward the silver watch resting beside the toolbox. You're wondering who the man beside me is. His name was Samuel Carter. He wasn't my brother by blood, but he was the closest thing I ever had. Samuel. I whispered the name aloud. Thomas continued. We built this workshop together. We learned our trade together. We buried our dreams together. I frowned. Buried. That wasn't a word Thomas used lightly. The next paragraph explained why. When we were young, we made one promise. If either of us ever became rich, the other family would never struggle. Smiled. It sounded exactly like 2 young men with more hope than money. But the smile slowly faded, because Thomas had underlined his next sentence. We never imagined one of us actually would. Blinked. Rich. Samuel. Nothing in 43 years of marriage had ever suggested that Thomas knew anyone wealthy. He had always lived modestly. He repaired old boots instead of buying new ones. He drove the same pickup truck for 26 years. He refused expensive vacations because he preferred fishing at the local lake. None of it fit. I hurried through the next pages. Thomas described how Samuel had moved away decades earlier after receiving an opportunity in another state. The 2 men wrote letters for years, then less frequently. Eventually, the letters stopped altogether. Thomas believed Samuel had simply built a new life. He accepted it without resentment, until one autumn afternoon. Nearly 18 years before Thomas died. A black sedan pulled into our driveway. Everything changed that day. And judging by the trembling handwriting filling the next several pages, Thomas had never been the same afterward. The next pages of the journal were dated. Thomas rarely dated his personal writing, so seeing an exact day immediately caught my attention. October 14th, 18 years before his death. He had underlined the date once. Nothing else. Then the entry began. Today, Samuel came home. I stopped reading and looked toward the workshop window. Not visited. Not arrived. Thomas still thought of this town as Samuel's home after all those years. Continued. I almost didn't recognize him. He stepped out of a black Lincoln wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than every tool I own. But when he smiled, he was still the same boy who once borrowed my lunch because he couldn't afford one. Smiled. That sounded exactly like Thomas. He never noticed expensive clothes before noticing someone smile. The journal described the reunion in remarkable detail. The two men embraced without speaking. Neither needed to. 40 years of friendship had survived decades of silence. Thomas wrote that they spent nearly 6 hours inside the workshop drinking coffee and talking about their families, their children, their failures, their regrets, everything except business. Only as the sun began to set did Samuel finally explain why he had returned. Thomas's handwriting became noticeably slower. Samuel is dying. I felt my throat tighten. He has no wife, no children, no brothers, no sisters. He says I am the last person who still remembers who he was before money changed everything. I closed my eyes for a moment. How lonely that sentence must have been. To become wealthy enough to own everything, yet lose everyone who truly knew you. The next paragraph answered the question that had haunted me since finding the photograph. Samuel hadn't simply become comfortable. He had built an industrial manufacturing company that supplied equipment across several states. According to Thomas, newspapers had occasionally written about him. I had never noticed. Thomas certainly never mentioned it. He continued writing. I asked why he never came back sooner. He said success kept giving him reasons to wait. Then illness removed every reason except one. I wiped another tear from my cheek. How many friendships disappear exactly that way? Not through anger. Not through betrayal. Only through the quiet belief that there will always be another year. Thomas described how Samuel reached inside a leather briefcase and placed several documents on the workbench. I thought he wanted me to repair something. I was wrong. He wanted me to protect something. Protect. There was that word again. Not hide. Not own. Protect. Thomas admitted he refused before Samuel had even finished explaining. We argued for nearly an hour. I told him I wasn't the right man. He laughed. That's exactly why you are. I leaned closer. The next lines had been written more heavily, as though Thomas wanted to remember every word. Samuel told me wealth changes people, but responsibility reveals them. He said money had already destroyed branches of his family. Cousins suing cousins. Friends becoming strangers. Employees pretending loyalty. He trusted almost no one, except Thomas. That realization settled heavily over me. Not because Thomas had been perfect, but because Samuel believed he was honest enough to carry a burden no one else could. The journal paused there for nearly half a page. No words, only blank paper. Then, at the bottom, Thomas wrote a single sentence. I accepted because friendship sometimes asks for things that make no sense. I slowly turned the page. The handwriting changed again. Smaller. More deliberate. As I write this tonight, the toolbox is no longer mine. I looked instinctively toward the old blue box beside me. No longer mine. What did that mean? The answer came immediately. Everything inside now belongs to another story. A chill traveled slowly down my spine. Another story. Not another person. Not another family. Story. Whatever Samuel had entrusted to Thomas, it had remained hidden inside that toolbox ever since. Not because Thomas wanted to keep a secret. Because he had made a promise. Same way. I had. For a long time, I simply sat there with the journal resting on my lap. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the workshop floor. The storm-damaged roof allowed thin beams of sunlight to slip inside, illuminating tiny particles of dust that drifted through the quiet air. Everything around me suddenly felt different. For 15 years, I had believed the toolbox contained one secret. Now I realized it contained two. Thomas's promise. And Samuel's. I gently closed the journal and picked up the envelope that bore my name. Unlike the journal, this one felt slightly heavier. There was more than a single sheet of paper inside. I hesitated. Strangely, opening the toolbox had been easier than opening this envelope. The toolbox had belonged to Thomas. But these words, these had been written specifically for me. I carefully broke the seal. Inside were 3 folded pages and a small black and white photograph. The photograph showed Thomas sitting on the workshop steps. Beside him sat Samuel. They looked much older than in the pocket watch photograph. Gray hair. Wrinkled faces. But the smiles were exactly the same. On the back, Thomas had written only one sentence. The last afternoon we were simply friends. I swallowed hard. The letter began. My dearest Mary. If you've reached this page, then life has finally decided for you. I always hoped it would. I never wanted you to carry the burden of choosing between your promise to me and your own curiosity. So if you're reading this now, you've already honored me more than I ever deserved. I stopped for a moment. Those words settled somewhere deep inside me. All these years, I had worried about disappointing him. He had been worried about protecting me. I continued reading. You've probably imagined 1,000 possibilities. Gold. Jewels. A hidden fortune. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I laughed quietly through my tears. He knew me too well. The greatest treasure I've ever protected was never money. It was trust. I looked toward the journal. That sentence explained everything. Thomas had never considered himself the owner of whatever Samuel left behind, only its guardian. The next paragraph finally addressed the mystery. Samuel asked me to keep several documents hidden until 2 conditions had been met. The first, his death. The second, my own. I frowned. Why both? Thomas answered before I could finish the thought. He feared greedy people while he was alive. He feared desperate people after he died. He believed only time could separate those two. 15 years. Perhaps that was why Thomas had never given me a date. No calendar could predict when enough time had passed. Only life could. The letter continued. The documents are hidden somewhere that only patience could uncover. If you found them, you found them honestly. I looked around the workshop. Every clue, every carving, every hidden compartment. None of it could have been solved quickly. Thomas hadn't hidden the truth. He had slowed people down until only someone who truly cared would keep searching. Then I reached the sentence that changed everything. When you remove the journal, lift the cedar panel beneath it. Froze. The false bottom. I had removed the tray. But I had never questioned the wooden base underneath the journal. Slowly I looked back into the toolbox. The leather journal still rested exactly where I had left it. Beneath it, a perfectly fitted cedar panel. Almost invisible. Almost. I carefully lifted the journal once again. Then slid my fingertips beneath the edge of the cedar board. It rose effortlessly. Hidden beneath it was another compartment, far deeper than the first. Inside rested a thick leather document case tied with a faded brown cord. Beside it lay a small brass plaque. Polished and tarnished. Waiting. Picked it up. 5 engraved words stared back at me. Open only after understanding. Not after waiting. Not after finding the key. Not after reading the journal. After understanding. I slowly looked around the empty workshop. For the first time since Thomas died. Believed I finally did. I did not open the leather document case. Not immediately. For the second time that afternoon, I found myself sitting quietly in Thomas's old chair, simply looking at something he had protected for years. The words engraved on the brass plaque echoed in my mind. Open only after understanding. It wasn't another puzzle. It was a warning. Thomas wasn't asking whether I knew where the documents were. He was asking whether I understood why they had been hidden in the first place. Those were two very different things. I rested my hands on the worn leather case. It felt surprisingly soft despite its age. The brown cord tying it shut had faded almost to gray, but the knot itself remained firm. Thomas had tied it. I recognized the knot instantly. He used the same simple square knot on fishing lines, tool rolls, Christmas decorations, and even the swing he built for our grandchildren beneath the old maple tree. He always said the best knots weren't the hardest to untie. They were the ones tied with care. Smiled. Even now, his habits surrounded me. Before opening anything else, I picked up the journal once more. Several pages remained unread. Perhaps Thomas still had something important to tell me. The next entry had no date. Only a title. If you're ready. I took a slow breath. I've spent many nights wondering whether I made the right decision. Samuel trusted me because he believed I valued people more than possessions. I hope he was right. I never once looked at the documents. That sentence stopped me. I read it again. Floor. Had never opened them. For 18 years. He had hidden something without ever satisfying his own curiosity. I leaned back in complete disbelief. Most people couldn't keep themselves from opening an unexpected package delivered by mistake. Thomas had protected sealed documents for nearly 2 decades, without reading a single page. The realization humbled me. His promise had been even greater than mine. He continued. I knew that if I opened them, I would no longer be protecting Samuel's trust. I would be protecting my own knowledge. There is a difference. A very important difference. Until that moment, I had never considered that trust could be changed simply by knowing too much. Thomas had refused knowledge. Because friendship mattered more. Another page. Another lesson. If you decide to continue, remember something. The papers themselves are not the inheritance. They only explain it. I frowned. Not the inheritance. Then what was? I turned another page. The real inheritance already exists. It has existed for years. You've probably walked past it countless times. I instinctively looked around the workshop. Past it. Surely not here. Well, that couldn't be right. Thomas anticipated the thought. No. Not inside this building. My pulse quickened. He knew exactly what I would assume. He always did. The inheritance isn't hidden. It never was. It has simply gone unnoticed. I lowered the journal. Outside the workshop window, the afternoon breeze stirred the branches of the old maple tree. The fields beyond our property glowed softly beneath the setting sun. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Ordinary, peaceful, familiar. What could possibly have been sitting in plain sight all these years? I hurried to the next page. If you're looking for a chest of gold, you'll be disappointed. If you're looking for justice, keep reading. Justice. That word carried far more weight than money ever could. The final paragraph on the page had been written more slowly than the rest. Almost as though Thomas had paused after every sentence. Samuel never asked me to protect wealth. He asked me to protect fairness. He believed those are rarely the same thing. I closed the journal for a moment. Fairness. Not fortune. Not power. Not revenge. Fairness. Whatever lay inside the leather document case. It wasn't about making someone rich. It was about making something right. For the first time, I untied the faded brown cord. The leather flap opened gently. Inside rested several neatly organized folders. Property records, legal documents, typed letters, and on the very top, a sealed envelope bearing a name I had never seen before. Elizabeth Carter. I had never heard the name Elizabeth Carter before. Not once. Not in 43 years of marriage. Not during family dinners. Not while looking through old photo albums. Not even during the stories Thomas loved telling our grandchildren on quiet Sunday afternoons. Yet here it was, typed neatly across the front of a cream-colored envelope that had remained hidden beneath the toolbox all these years. Elizabeth Carter. The last name immediately caught my attention. Carter. Samuel's last name. I slowly placed the envelope on the workbench without opening it. Thomas had already taught me one important lesson that afternoon. Every answer deserved its proper order. If I rushed now, I might misunderstand everything that followed. Beneath the envelope lay several legal folders arranged with extraordinary precision. The first contained land records. Not for our property. For farmland nearly 80 miles away. The deed stretched back more than 60 years, changing hands from one owner to another before eventually being purchased by a company whose name meant nothing to me. The second folder contained newspaper clippings. Most were carefully trimmed around articles mentioning Samuel Carter's manufacturing business, factory expansion, scholarship donations, community awards, retirement announcements. The articles painted the picture of a respected businessman. Successful, generous, quiet. Nothing suggested scandal. Nothing suggested conflict. Which made the next folder even more surprising. Across the front, Thomas had written only 2 words. Read last. Obeyed. Instead, I continued sorting the remaining documents. There were handwritten letters exchanged between Thomas and Samuel over nearly 30 years. I read only portions of them. Enough to understand the friendship. Not enough to invade moments that belonged only to the two of them. The letters were wonderfully ordinary. Samuel asking whether Thomas still fished at Miller's Lake. Thomas describing Emily's first bicycle. Samuel complaining about endless business meetings. Thomas joking that retirement had somehow given him even less free time. 2 old friends. Trying desperately not to let distance erase familiarity. Then the tone changed. The later letters became shorter. More serious. Samuel wrote less about business. More about loneliness. One sentence refused to leave my thoughts. Success keeps introducing me to people who admire my accomplishments but know nothing about my life. Thomas had underlined that sentence in blue ink. Perhaps because he understood it immediately. Perhaps because he feared it. As evening approached, I finally picked up the envelope addressed to Elizabeth Carter. It was still sealed. Unlike the letter Thomas had written for me. Unlike the journal. Unlike everything else inside the toolbox. This envelope had never been opened by anyone. Not even Thomas. Written beneath Elizabeth's name, in Samuel's elegant handwriting, were additional instructions. To be delivered only if she is alive. Only if she is alive. A strange instruction. Why not simply write her a letter? Why leave it hidden for decades? I carefully turned the envelope over. The seal remained perfect, untouched. Whatever Samuel wanted Elizabeth to know, no one had ever read it. Not even the man entrusted to protect it. My eyes drifted toward the final folder. The one Thomas had labeled read last. Perhaps the explanation waited there. I opened it carefully. Inside rested only 3 typed pages. No signatures. No legal language. Just a simple title. Why none of this could be done earlier? I began reading. Samuel explained that Elizabeth Carter was his granddaughter. His only grandchild. She had been 6 years old when he and Thomas made their agreement. The time. She had no idea her grandfather possessed considerable wealth. Samuel wanted it that way. He believed children should grow up building character before inheriting comfort. So he created a series of legal protections designed to keep every major asset beyond anyone's reach until long after both men were gone. Not because he distrusted Elizabeth, because he distrusted everyone around her. Then came the sentence that made me slowly lower the papers onto the workbench. Samuel had discovered that several distant relatives were already attempting to influence Elizabeth's future. Not through love, through expectation, through promises, through carefully disguised manipulation. He feared that if she inherited too early, she would never know who truly cared about her. So he did something extraordinary. He disappeared from her life. Not completely, but enough that everyone, including Elizabeth herself, believed nearly everything had already been settled. He allowed history to tell the wrong story, so that the right people would eventually reveal themselves. I read the final paragraph 3 times before its meaning fully settled in my heart. Samuel hadn't hidden his wealth. He had hidden the truth about it. There was a difference. Money locked inside a vault eventually attracts thieves. But a story carefully misunderstood can remain untouched for generations. I leaned back in Thomas's chair and stared through the broken roof at the evening sky. For years, I had believed the greatest act of love was protecting what we owned. Thomas and Samuel believed something far more difficult. Sometimes love meant protecting someone from what they owned. The thought lingered as I picked up the next page. Samuel described how his attorneys had repeatedly advised him against the plan. They insisted it was too complicated, too risky, too dependent on people keeping promises. One lawyer had laughed outright. No agreement survives 2 funerals. Samuel had written only one response beneath that memory. My lawyer never met Thomas. Despite everything that had happened that day, I smiled. Well, he hadn't. Few people ever truly understood my husband. They saw a quiet mechanic with rough hands and oil-stained shirts. They never noticed the extraordinary strength hidden beneath that ordinary life. Thomas believed promises were living things. Once spoken, they deserved to breathe until fulfilled. The documents explained that Samuel had gradually transferred nearly every major decision concerning his estate into an independent trust years before his death. The trustees were responsible for preserving the assets. But one final authorization, one last instruction, could only be released after very specific conditions had been satisfied. Both men had to be gone. Enough time had to pass. And one final package had to reach Elizabeth. Not through lawyers, not through newspapers, not through distant relatives, through someone who had nothing to gain. Someone who wasn't connected to the fortune. Someone who had never even seen the documents. Or, if necessary, me. I slowly closed my eyes. Suddenly everything made sense. The toolbox had never been about secrecy. Had been about independence. If lawyers delivered the letter, people would question their motives. If relatives delivered it, people would assume manipulation. But an elderly widow living quietly on a small property nearly 80 miles away, no one would suspect her of anything. Perhaps that was exactly why Samuel had trusted Thomas. And why Thomas had trusted me. My attention shifted back to Elizabeth's sealed envelope. I wondered what kind of woman she had become. Was she kind? Was she married? Did she have children? Did she still remember her grandfather? Or had time erased him almost completely? The answer came unexpectedly. Inside the document case rested one final folder. Across the tab someone had typed, "Annual Reports." Curious, I opened it. Instead of financial records, I found short summaries prepared once every year. Each report contained only a single page. Each described Elizabeth's life. 10. Excellent student. 13. Won a regional science competition. 16. Volunteer at local animal shelter. 20. University scholarship. Age 24. Graduated without debt. Age 27. Opened a community health clinic. I frowned. Someone had quietly watched her life for years. Not to control it, to ensure she was safe. Every report focused on character rather than success. Generous, honest, hardworking, compassionate. Never once did the reports mention income, appearance, or social status. only the kind of person she was becoming. Near the bottom of the final report, prepared only months before Thomas died, one sentence had been highlighted. Subject continues refusing financial assistance despite personal sacrifices. I felt tears welling once more. She had no idea. No idea that the future her grandfather had spent decades protecting was quietly waiting for her. Not because she needed wealth, but because she had already proven she didn't. For the first time all day, I found myself looking not at the papers, but at the road leading away from our house. Somewhere beyond those hills, Elizabeth Carter was living an ordinary life, completely unaware that 15 years after Thomas's death, an old widow had finally opened a rusted toolbox, and everything her grandfather had hoped for was finally about to begin. The next morning I woke before sunrise, not because I had slept well, quite the opposite. My mind had spent the entire night returning to the same thought. Somewhere, a woman named Elizabeth Carter was living an ordinary life, completely unaware that two old friends had quietly spent decades protecting her future. I made coffee, but I never drank it. Instead, I carried the warm mug onto the porch and watched the mist settle across the fields. Thomas used to love mornings like this. He believed dawn made every difficult decision seem a little gentler. Perhaps he was right. After breakfast, I returned to the workshop carrying an empty cardboard box. Before reading anything else, I carefully removed every document from the toolbox. The journal, the letters, the leather case, the photograph, pocket watch, even the old tools. Each one deserved better than remaining inside a building with half its roof missing. As I lifted the wooden-handled hammer from its place, something unexpected caught my attention. The outline beneath it. Every tool rested inside a perfectly carved recess lined with thin green felt. Thomas hadn't simply placed the tools inside the toolbox. He had custom-built the interior. I looked more carefully. The screwdrivers fit perfectly. The wrenches fit perfectly. Even the tiny oil can had its own exact space. No movement. No rattling. Everything had been measured with extraordinary precision. Then I realized something. There was one empty space. A narrow rectangular recess. Unlike the others, it contained nothing. It had been empty from the beginning. I frowned. How had I missed it? The space wasn't large. Perhaps 6 inches long. 2 inches wide. Shallow. Almost exactly the size of small notebook or cassette tape. Oh. Thomas had designed this decades before cassette tapes became common. I examined the recess more closely. Tiny scratches covered the felt lining. Something had definitely rested there for many years. Something that had later been removed. The question was, by whom? Thomas, Samuel, or someone else? I searched the journal for any mention of another hidden item. Nothing. I reread Samuel's letters. Nothing. Then my eyes settled once again on the annual reports describing Elizabeth's life. Every report had been typed. Every report ended with identical initials. Not Thomas. Not Samuel. Someone else had continued watching over Elizabeth long after Samuel died. Someone whose identity appeared nowhere in the documents. Someone who had access to information neither Thomas nor I could possibly have known. Who was RH? I searched every folder. Finally, at the bottom of the final report, almost hidden beneath the margin, a single typed sentence appeared. Final observation submitted in accordance with Mr. Carter's instructions. That meant RH wasn't acting independently. He or she had simply been completing Samuel's final request. The reports ended the same year Thomas died. No additional observations existed. No updates. No indication of what happened afterward. Only silence. I leaned back slowly. 4 years. Someone had quietly ensured Elizabeth remained safe. Then, the moment Thomas passed away, the watching stopped. Not because the mission had failed. Because it had finally been completed. My eyes drifted toward the sealed envelope addressed to Elizabeth. Perhaps that envelope explained everything. Perhaps it explained nothing. The way, it no longer belonged inside the workshop. For the first time since opening the toolbox, I wrapped the envelope carefully in clean cloth, not to hide it, but to protect it, exactly as Thomas had protected it before me. Only now, the responsibility belonged to someone else. Me. The responsibility felt heavier than the toolbox ever had. For 15 years, all I had needed to do was protect a promise. Now I had to fulfill one. There was an enormous difference between keeping something safe and knowing the moment had come to let it go. I carried the wrapped envelope into the house and placed it beside Thomas's photograph on the mantel. For several minutes I simply stood there. His smile looked exactly as it always had. Patient, almost amused. "You knew this day would come, didn't you?" I whispered. The silence that followed felt strangely comforting. Thomas had always believed that people eventually answered their own questions if they waited long enough. Perhaps that was why he never rushed anyone. Not me. Not our children. Not even himself. That afternoon, I decided it was finally time to read the last pages of the journal. Until then, I had been so focused on Samuel's story that I had forgotten the journal had originally belonged to my husband. The remaining pages were noticeably shorter. Less like records, more like reflections. The first sentence immediately caught my attention. "Mary, if you've come this far, then you're probably wondering why I never told you any of this." I smiled sadly. He was right. That question had been growing louder with every page. His answer was simple. "Because I wanted you to remember me for the life we built together, not for the burden I carried afterward." I slowly sat down. How perfectly that described Thomas. Even during his illness, he rarely spoke about pain. He preferred talking about our grandchildren, the tomatoes growing behind the barn, the birdhouse that needed repainting, anything except himself. The journal continued. "I've watched people become prisoners of secrets. They stop laughing. They stop trusting. They stop living. I couldn't allow that to happen to you." A tear slipped onto the page. For all those years, I had occasionally resented his silence. Now I understood that his silence had been another act of love. He wasn't hiding the truth from me. He was protecting the years we still had together. The next page contained something completely unexpected. A list. Not of instructions. Not of names. But memories. Our first dance. The storm that flooded the kitchen. The night Mark was born. The camping trip where we got hopelessly lost. Emily falling asleep in my workshop. The roses outside the window. One ordinary moment after another. At the bottom, Thomas had written, "If you remember these before you remember the toolbox, then I succeeded." Closed my eyes. He had. Without question. For 15 years, the toolbox had remained locked. But those memories, they had never needed protection. They had lived inside me every single day. I turned the final page. Only a few paragraphs remained. "When all of this is finished, don't keep my workshop exactly as I left it." I frowned. That surprised me. "I know you'll be tempted. But workshops aren't museums. They're places where things are repaired. If nobody builds anything here again, then I've left behind a monument. I never wanted a monument. I wanted usefulness." I looked slowly around the room. The old bench, the worn vise, the pegboard covered with tools. For 15 years, I had preserved everything exactly as it had been. But I had misunderstood what Thomas would have wanted. The final sentence was underlined. Not once. If this room ever becomes silent forever, then I truly will be gone." I gently closed the journal. Outside, the afternoon breeze drifted through the broken roof, gently stirring the wood shavings that still rested beneath the bench. For the first time since his funeral, the workshop no longer felt like a place where life had ended. It felt like a place quietly waiting for someone to begin again. The following Monday, I drove into town for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. The leather document case rested on the passenger seat beside me, wrapped in the same linen cloth Thomas had once used to protect his favorite woodworking tools. I wasn't taking it anywhere yet. I simply couldn't bear leaving it alone in the damaged workshop any longer. The insurance repairs would begin within days. Too many strangers would be walking in and out of the building. The promise had changed hands. Now it was mine to protect. I stopped at the small diner near the courthouse, the same place Thomas and I had visited every Friday after grocery shopping. Very little had changed. The booths were still covered in cracked green vinyl. The waitress still called everyone honey. Even the old wall clock still ran 5 minutes slow. As I stirred my coffee absent-mindedly, someone approached my table. Mrs. Morgan. I looked up. For a moment, I couldn't place the face. Gray hair. Kind eyes. A little heavier than I remembered. Then recognition arrived. David. He smiled. I wasn't sure you'd remember me. David Harper. He had been one of Thomas's apprentices almost 30 years earlier. Back then he was a shy teenager who spent every Saturday in the workshop learning how to restore antique furniture. Thomas adored teaching him. You've hardly changed, I lied. He laughed. My knees disagree. We talked for nearly half an hour. About the town. About our families. About Thomas. David became unexpectedly quiet. I still use his measuring square every day. You do. He gave it to me when I opened my own shop. Smiled. That sounded exactly like Thomas. He said tools shouldn't retire just because their owners do. For some reason those words struck me differently now. Nothing Thomas owned had ever been meant to sit untouched forever. Not the workshop. Not the tools. Not even the toolbox. Before leaving, David hesitated. I've wanted to ask you something for years. What is it? Did Mr. Morgan ever tell you about the visitor? My heartbeat slowed. What visitor? David frowned. The gentleman who used to come every autumn. Every autumn. I stared at him. No. David looked genuinely surprised. I assumed you knew. He always arrived in a black sedan. He and Mr. Morgan would spend hours inside the workshop. I never heard what they talked about. They always looked happy when they left. Samuel. Had to be. Yet something didn't fit. According to the journal, Samuel had eventually stopped writing, then returned only once after many years. David shook his head. No. I saw him several times. Several times. Not once. Several. I felt a chill spread through my chest. Either David's memory was mistaken, or Thomas had quietly met Samuel far more often than the journal revealed. As though reading my thoughts, David added one final detail. The last time I saw him, it was only a few months before Mr. Morgan got sick. My mind raced. That couldn't be. Thomas had written that Samuel returned 18 years earlier. Nothing about later visits. Nothing. Thomas had intentionally left those meetings out. I thanked David and walked slowly back to my car. For the first time since opening the toolbox, I realized something important. The journal wasn't a complete history. It was only the part Thomas wanted me to know first. Or, there were still pieces of the story missing. And judging by the quiet smile on Thomas's face in that final photograph, he had always intended for me to find them. I drove home with more questions than answers. For the first time since opening the toolbox, I found myself wondering whether Thomas had deliberately left parts of the story untold. First, the thought bothered me. Then I smiled. Of course he had. Thomas never overwhelmed people with information. He believed truth should arrive in the same way a sunrise did. Slowly. Naturally. One light at a time. Oh. David's words refused to leave my mind. I saw him several times. Not once. Several. When I reached home, I carried the document case into the living room instead of returning it to the workshop. The house felt different now. For 15 years it had been filled with memories. Now it also contained unfinished responsibilities. After dinner, I opened the journal again. This time, instead of reading from the beginning, I carefully examined every page. Margins, blank spaces, folded corners. Thomas had always hidden little notes inside books for me to discover months, or sometimes years, later. Old habits rarely disappear. On nearly the last page, something unusual caught my attention. The paper looked slightly thicker, not damaged, layered. I held it toward the lamp. Almost invisible. A faint rectangle appeared beneath the final sheet. My heartbeat quickened. Very carefully, I slid a thin letter opener between the pages. The back cover had been built with a hidden pocket. Inside rested one final folded note, smaller than my hand. No envelope, no date. Only 3 words written across the front. When David asks. Froze. David. Not if. When. My hands began trembling. Thomas had known. Years before his death. He somehow knew David Harper would eventually ask about Samuel. I unfolded the note. Mary. If you found this. Then David finally remembered. I stared at the page in disbelief. How could Thomas possibly have predicted something so specific? Then I smiled. He hadn't predicted it. He knew David, just as well as he knew me. The note continued. David notices details. He always has. That's why I taught him. He remembers people better than dates. One day he'll mention Samuel. But his memory won't be entirely correct. I leaned closer. So don't doubt him. But don't doubt me either. I frowned. How could both men be right? Thomas answered immediately. Samuel visited only once after many years. The other visits were not Samuel. A chill ran slowly through my body. Not Samuel. Then who? The handwriting became smaller. They were Richard. Richard. Not Samuel. Not David. Richard. The initials on the annual reports. My breath caught. Richard. Harper. Oh. David's last name was Harper. Could they be related? Kept reading. Richard Harper. David's older brother. Everything suddenly began fitting together. Richard had never appeared in the journal because he wasn't part of Thomas's past. He was part of Samuel's plan. Thomas continued. Samuel hired Richard many years later. Not as an investigator. Not as security. But as a witness. A witness. The word lingered in my thoughts. Witness to what? Richard's only responsibility was to quietly confirm that Elizabeth continued living the kind of life Samuel hoped she would choose on her own. Nothing more. No interference. No conversations. No gift. No advice. Only observation. Every annual report. Every initial. Every update. Richard. Not some mysterious detective. Simply an honest man quietly keeping one final promise for another. Then came the sentence that brought everything together. David never knew. He simply saw his brother's truck parked beside the workshop. And because the two brothers looked remarkably alike, he always believed the visitor was Samuel. I leaned back in complete silence. Neither David nor Thomas had been wrong. Each had only known part of the truth. Thomas had protected Samuel's promise. Richard had protected Elizabeth's future. David had unknowingly preserved the final clue. 3 ordinary men. 3 separate promises. Quietly connected for decades. At the bottom of the note, Thomas had written one final instruction. Tomorrow. Call Richard. Beneath the sentence. For the very first time anywhere in the journal, there was a phone number. The phone number sat at the bottom of the page like it had been waiting for me all these years. I copied it onto a small notepad before closing the journal. For several minutes, I simply stared at the telephone sitting on the kitchen counter. It seemed ridiculous that a simple phone call could bring me closer to answers Thomas had protected for nearly 2 decades. Yet I couldn't ignore his final instruction. Tomorrow. Call Richard. The next morning arrived with clear skies for the first time since the storm. Sunlight poured through the kitchen windows as though the world itself had decided enough clouds had passed. I made coffee, fed the birds, watered the roses, performed every ordinary task exactly as I always had. Only then did I pick up the receiver. My fingers hesitated over the numbers. One by one, I dialed them. The line rang only twice. "Hello." The voice sounded calm. "Older. Uncle. May I speak with Richard Harper?" A brief silence followed. "This is Richard." I swallowed. "My name is Mary Morgan." "Nothing." A long, slow breath on the other end. "I've been wondering when you would call. Not if, when." Just like Thomas had written. For a moment neither of us spoke. Finally Richard broke the silence. "Did you open the toolbox?" "Yes." "Then Thomas kept his promise." "He did." "And now," Richard said quietly, "it's my turn." His words carried no excitement, no surprise, only relief, as though he had been carrying his own invisible weight for many years. We spoke for nearly an hour. Richard explained that Samuel had contacted him shortly after receiving his medical diagnosis. Not because Richard worked for him. Because Samuel had once helped Richard's family during the hardest year of their lives. When David and Richard were teenagers, their father had died unexpectedly. Samuel quietly paid for Richard's technical school tuition without ever asking for recognition. Years later, Richard insisted on repaying the kindness. Samuel refused. "Is it?" He offered him something else. A promise. Richard accepted immediately. His task was astonishingly simple. Once every year, he would drive through Elizabeth's town. Never introduce himself. Never interfere. Never influence her choices. Only observe. Was she healthy? Working? Kind? Safe? Then he would write a single report. Nothing more. If she ever became dependent on wealth, Samuel had told him, the plan ends. If she ever became cruel, the plan ends. If she ever expected an inheritance, the plan ends. Closed my eyes. Samuel hadn't been testing her worth. He had been protecting her freedom. Richard continued. There were years when I almost hoped she'd fail. I frowned. What do you mean? He sighed softly. Because if she had, my responsibility would have ended. Is it? Every year. Elizabeth quietly proved Samuel right. She worked 2 jobs through college. She refused special treatment. She volunteered at clinics. She donated blood regularly. She cared for elderly neighbors. None of those things were required. No one knew she was being observed. She simply chose them. Again and again. Richard laughed quietly. One year I watched her return a wallet containing nearly $3,000. She refused the reward. Another year, she spent Christmas repairing a shelter damaged by flooding instead of taking the vacation she'd been saving for. Every report became easier to write. Not because Richard knew what she would do, because she kept surprising him. Then his voice became noticeably quieter. I attended Samuel's funeral. So did Elizabeth. They stood less than 20 feet apart. I frowned. They never spoke. No. She thought he was simply a distant relative. My heart ached. How many opportunities had life quietly placed before them? Without either knowing. Before hanging up, Richard asked only one question. Have you read Elizabeth's letter? No. Good. Neither have I. Another promise. Another person. Another life shaped by trust instead of curiosity. Just before we ended the call, Richard said something Thomas himself could have spoken. Mrs. Morgan, we've both protected this story long enough. I think it's finally time for Elizabeth to hear it. For the rest of that afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about Elizabeth. Not the inheritance. Not the legal documents. Not even Samuel. Just Elizabeth. For nearly 30 years, complete strangers had quietly protected a future she didn't even know existed. Yet none of them had tried to shape the person she became. They simply stepped back and allowed her to become herself. The more I thought about it, the more extraordinary it seemed. Most inheritances arrive with expectations. Use the money wisely. Continue the family business. Protect the family name. Samuel had asked for none of those things. He wanted only one certainty: that his granddaughter would never have to wonder whether kindness came naturally to her, or had been purchased. That evening, I unlocked the leather document case once more. This time, I wasn't searching for hidden compartments. I wanted to understand everything before meeting Elizabeth. At the bottom of the case rested one final folder I hadn't examined carefully. Across the cover, in Thomas's handwriting, were 4 simple words. Only if she comes. Elizabeth. Inside were several blank pages. Nothing else. First, I thought something had been removed. Then I noticed a folded sheet tucked into the back cover. It wasn't addressed to anyone. Simply carried a title. She asks why. Thomas had prepared an answer. Not about money. About life. I began reading. Elizabeth. If you're holding these papers, you may wonder why your grandfather chose such a difficult path. The answer is simpler than you imagine. He didn't want to discover whether you could handle wealth. He wanted you to discover that you could handle life. Pause. Those words carried a quiet wisdom that sounded unmistakably like Thomas. The letter continued. Money solves many problems, but it also creates questions that honest work never asks. Who loves me? Who needs me? Who stays if everything disappears tomorrow? Your grandfather wanted those answers to arrive before anything else. I slowly looked out the workshop window. How many people spend their entire lives searching for those answers? Elizabeth, without realizing it, already had them. The next paragraph touched me even more deeply. If you're disappointed that this took so long, please forgive 2 old men. We weren't trying to delay your happiness. We were protecting your peace. I smiled through another tear. That was exactly how Thomas viewed the world. Peace was more valuable than comfort. Character more valuable than success. Trust more valuable than certainty. At the very bottom of the page, Thomas had added one handwritten sentence after Samuel's typed letter. I've never met you, Elizabeth. But if Samuel loved you, I already know enough. I placed the page gently back into the folder. For a long moment, I simply sat there listening to the familiar sounds outside. The wind moving through the trees. Birds settling for the evening. The distant hum of a tractor somewhere across the valley. Everything felt strangely complete. Not because the mystery had ended. 'Cause I finally understood it. The toolbox had never been about hiding a fortune. It had been about preserving trust. The hidden key had never tested intelligence. It had tested patience. The journal had never been written to explain Samuel. It had been written to prepare me. And suddenly, I realized something else. Thomas hadn't asked me to deliver the papers immediately. He had only asked me to understand them first. No, for the first time. I truly did. Tomorrow, I would begin looking for Elizabeth Carter. Not as the keeper of an inheritance, but as the final friend. Keeping one last promise. The next morning I began with the simplest question. Where was Elizabeth Carter? The documents contained no address, no telephone number, only the annual reports, each ending with the same initials, RH, and the knowledge that she had once opened a small community health clinic. That was enough to begin. I called Richard Harper again. He answered almost immediately. I was hoping you'd call. I need to find her. I know. A brief silence followed before he spoke again. I can tell you where she worked the last time I saw her. That may not be where she is now, but it's the best place to start. He gave me the name of a small town less than 2 hours away. Smaller than ours. The kind of place where everyone recognized every face. I haven't been there in years, Richard admitted. My responsibility ended after Thomas passed. You've never met her. Never. You watched her all those years. And never introduced yourself. He laughed softly. That was the hardest part. I wanted to tell her how proud her grandfather would have been. But promises don't become easier just because they're painful. After hanging up, I folded Elizabeth's sealed letter back into the linen cloth. The legal documents remained safely inside the leather case. I wasn't ready to carry those yet. First, I needed to know who Elizabeth had become. Not through reports, through my own eyes. The drive took nearly 2 hours. The roads narrowed as I left the highway behind, winding through farms and quiet stretches of countryside that reminded me of the place where Thomas and I had built our life. When I finally reached the town, I parked beside a small brick building with a modest sign. Carter Community Health Clinic. My heart skipped. The clinic still carried her name. Inside, the waiting room was simple but welcoming. Children colored at a small table in one corner. An elderly man read yesterday's newspaper. Fresh flowers stood near the reception desk. Nothing looked expensive. Everything looked cared for. A young receptionist smiled. "Can I help you?" I was hoping to speak with Elizabeth Carter. "I'm sorry." The young woman smiled apologetically. "Dr. Carter retired from the clinic 6 months ago." Retired. And blinked. The reports had stopped years ago. Time had continued moving without any of us. "Do you know where I might find her?" The receptionist hesitated. "I'm not really supposed to give out personal information." "Of course. I understand." I thanked her and turned toward the door. "Mrs. Morgan." "Stop. I didn't tell you my name." She smiled. "No. You didn't." She walked around the desk carrying a framed photograph. "I only guessed because." She handed it to me. My breath caught. The photograph showed Elizabeth standing outside the clinic. Beside her was Thomas, older, gray-haired, smiling. I stared at the picture in complete disbelief. Thomas, standing beside Elizabeth, not as strangers, friends. The date engraved beneath the frame was only 4 years before he died. Long after the journal claimed Samuel's story had ended. I looked up slowly. "You knew my husband?" The receptionist nodded. "My grandmother did. She was Elizabeth Carter." Could barely speak. "And you are?" "My name is Anna. Elizabeth is my grandmother." I looked back at the photograph. Every certainty I had built over the past several days quietly shifted. Thomas hadn't merely protected Elizabeth from a distance. Some point, without ever telling me, he had finally met her. And judging by the warmth in both of their smiles, he had come to care about her deeply. Somehow, he had still managed to keep every promise he'd ever made. For a long moment, I couldn't take my eyes off the photograph. Thomas stood beside Elizabeth outside the clinic, both of them smiling with the quiet ease of people who genuinely enjoyed one another's company. There was no stiffness, no formality, no sign that this was a first meeting. Whatever relationship they had shared had taken time to build. I slowly handed the frame back to Anna. "My husband never told me he knew your grandmother." Anna smiled gently. "My grandmother said he was one of the kindest men she'd ever met." My throat tightened. "When did they meet?" She thought for a moment. "I was still in high school. Grandma volunteered at a free medical clinic every Saturday. One morning an older gentleman arrived carrying a box of broken wooden chairs. The clinic couldn't afford replacements, so he repaired every single one." Closed my eyes. Of course he did. That was Thomas. Something was broken. He fixed it. Without asking who would notice. Anna continued. "He kept coming back. Not because anything else needed repairing. He'd drink coffee with Grandma after the volunteers finished. They talked for hours." "What about?" She laughed softly. "I don't know. But Grandma always came home smiling." A strange warmth spread through my chest. Thomas had managed to know Elizabeth, without ever telling her the truth. He had honored Samuel's promise completely. He never approached her as the guardian of an inheritance. He approached her simply as Thomas, an old man fixing chairs, helping where he could, expecting nothing. Anna excused herself for a moment before returning with a small notebook. "I think Grandma left something here." She carefully turned several pages. There, she smiled. She volunteers every Thursday now. At St. Luke's Community Garden. She teaches elderly patients how to grow vegetables after rehabilitation. I couldn't help smiling. Even after retirement, Elizabeth was still serving others. Exactly as Richard's reports had described. Anna tore a small piece of paper from the notebook and wrote the address. As she handed it to me, she hesitated. May I ask something? Of course. Were you and Mr. Morgan very close? I laughed quietly. We were married for 43 years. She smiled. I can tell. How? The way you still say we. I hadn't even noticed. Even after 15 years. Part of me still spoke as though Thomas were waiting for me at home. Anna's expression softened. My grandmother does the same thing. My heart skipped. Her husband passed away. Anna nodded. 7 years ago. And she still talks about him in the present tense. For some reason. That simple detail made me feel connected to Elizabeth before we'd even met. 2 women. Different lives. Different towns. Both carrying love that time had never managed to erase. As I prepared to leave, Anna stopped me once more. Mrs. Morgan. There's something else. She disappeared into a small office before returning with a faded wooden box. Not a toolbox, just a simple cedar box. My grandmother asked me years ago if an elderly man named Thomas Morgan ever stopped coming. I should keep this safe. She placed it gently into my hands. She said one day, someone would know what to do with it. My pulse quickened. Cross the lid. Written in elegant handwriting were 5 familiar words. For the man who waited. For Thomas. For the man who waited. I slowly ran my fingertips across the smooth cedar lid. Thomas had never mentioned this box. Not once. Which meant, somewhere between the pages of the journal, the hidden key, the promises, and the old toolbox, there had always been one final piece of the story. Somehow, Elizabeth had been quietly protecting it. I didn't open the cedar box. Not there. Not in the middle of the clinic. After everything Thomas had taught me over the past few days, I had learned one lesson above all others. Some things deserved the right moment. I thanked Anna and carefully placed the small box inside my bag. As I reached the door, she called after me one last time. Mrs. Morgan. Yes. When you see Grandma. Please don't tell her I gave it to you. I looked back surprised. Why not? Anna smiled. Because she believes she's the one who's supposed to decide when it's finally opened. Those words lingered with me during the entire drive to St. Luke's Community Garden. The garden occupied an old church property on the edge of town. Raised wooden beds filled with tomatoes, herbs, beans, and flowers stretched across what had once been an empty field. Volunteers moved slowly between the rows, helping elderly men and women tend their small plots. Laughter drifted through the warm afternoon air. The place didn't feel like a medical program. Felt like hope. I parked beneath a large oak tree and walked through the entrance carrying only my handbag. The leather document case remained locked safely inside the car. This meeting wasn't about paperwork. It was about people. An elderly volunteer greeted me with a smile. Can I help you? I'm looking for Elizabeth Carter. He pointed toward the far end of the garden. She's teaching someone how to prune roses. Turned. About 50 yards away stood a woman with silver hair gathered into a loose braid beneath a straw hat. She knelt beside an older gentleman in a wheelchair, patiently showing him how to trim away dead branches without harming the healthy stems. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't giving instructions. She was teaching. Exactly the way Thomas had taught David all those years ago. Something tightened gently inside my chest. For a brief moment, it felt as though I were watching Thomas again. When she finally stood, I noticed how gracefully she moved despite her age. She laughed at something the gentleman said before placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Only then did she notice me. Our eyes met across the garden. She smiled politely. the kind smile someone offers a stranger. I walked toward her slowly. Mrs. Carter. Yes. My name is Mary Morgan. The smile remained. Polite. Respectful. Then I added 3 words. I knew Samuel. Everything changed. The smile disappeared. Not because of fear. Because of recognition. She looked at me for several long seconds. Then quietly asked, "My grandfather?" Yes. She removed her gardening gloves 1 finger at a time. I haven't heard anyone speak his name in years. I think, I replied softly. He wanted that to change. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the garden seemed to fade into the background. Finally, Elizabeth gestured toward a wooden bench beneath a flowering dogwood tree. Would you sit with me? We sat side by side without speaking. The breeze carried the scent of lavender and fresh soil. After several quiet minutes, Elizabeth smiled sadly. You know, my grandfather used to tell me stories about an old friend. He said the man could repair almost anything. Smiled. He wasn't exaggerating. She looked toward the distant garden beds. I always thought those stories were made up. They weren't. They were about my husband. Elizabeth slowly turned toward me. Thomas Morgan. She whispered his name with complete certainty. You know him. I did. Her eyes filled immediately. I've missed him. That sentence surprised me more than anything else I'd heard. You knew Thomas well. She nodded. For almost 10 years. I stared at her. 10 years. Thomas had never once mentioned her. Not one time. Elizabeth laughed softly through her tears. He made me promise something too. I felt my heartbeat quicken. What promise? She looked down at her hands. That if a woman named Mary Morgan ever came looking for me, I would finally open the cedar box. For a moment I forgot how to breathe. The cedar box rested quietly between us on the wooden bench. Elizabeth looked at it the way someone looks at a familiar object that has always been present, yet never fully understood. You've had this all these years? I asked softly. She nodded. Thomas brought it to me the day we first met. I frowned. The very first day. Yes. He repaired 6 broken chairs at the clinic. When everyone else left. He handed me this box. I looked down at the smooth cedar lid. He didn't tell you what was inside. No. He only smiled. That sounded exactly like Thomas. Elizabeth continued. He said, one day, someone named Mary Morgan will come looking for you. When she does, open this together. A chill slowly spread across my arms. Not alone. Together. Even now. Thomas was still bringing 2 strangers together before revealing the truth. Elizabeth gently rested her hand on the lid. I almost opened it dozens of times. I even held it in my lap after he died. But every time, I remembered his face. And somehow, I couldn't break my promise. Smiled. I know exactly how that feels. For the first time since we met, Elizabeth laughed. I suppose you do. Neither of us spoke for several moments. The garden around us remained wonderfully ordinary. A child laughed somewhere behind the greenhouse. Someone pushed a wheelbarrow filled with fresh compost. Birds landed briefly among the tomato plants. Life continued quietly around 2 women carrying promises made by the same man. Finally, Elizabeth untied the small leather cord securing the cedar box. The lid opened with surprising ease. There was no money, no jewelry, no hidden documents, only 3 carefully arranged objects. A folded letter, an old brass compass, a tiny cloth pouch. Elizabeth reached for the letter first. Across the front, written in Thomas's familiar handwriting, were the words, "To be read together." She looked at me. He nodded. Fully. She unfolded the paper. My dear Mary. My dear Elizabeth. If you're reading this together, then every promise has been kept. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Thomas continued. Samuel believed I protected his granddaughter. He was only half right. I protected her future. But Elizabeth, you protected mine. Elizabeth lowered the page. What does that mean? I don't know. She continued reading. After Samuel died, I realized something. No legal document could ever repay the kindness your grandfather showed me. But friendship has never measured debts. It only remembers them. A tear rolled slowly down Elizabeth's cheek. My hope, Thomas wrote, was never that you would inherit wealth. My hope was that one day, you and Mary would meet. You've spent your lives loving two men who loved each other like brothers. I thought, perhaps, you deserved to know one another too. Elizabeth smiled through her tears. So that was his real plan. I looked at her. Not the inheritance. She nodded. The friendship. For all those years, I had believed the toolbox protected documents. In truth, it had protected a relationship that neither of us even knew we had been given. Elizabeth carefully lifted the brass compass from the cedar box. Its polished lid reflected the afternoon sunlight. When she opened it, instead of a compass needle, there was a tiny photograph beneath the glass. Thomas, Samuel, standing shoulder to shoulder outside the workshop. Young, laughing, completely unaware of how far their promises would one day travel. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to, because in that quiet garden, surrounded by growing things, two old friends had somehow managed to introduce us 15 years after one had died, and nearly 30 years after the other had made his final promise. Neither Elizabeth nor I spoke for a long time. The photograph remained between us inside the old brass compass. Two young men, one promise, and a friendship that had quietly outlived both of them. Finally, Elizabeth reached for the tiny cloth pouch resting at the bottom of the cedar box. It was tied with faded blue thread. The fabric itself was worn almost transparent from age. She looked at me. I suppose we've come too far to stop now. Smiled. I think Thomas would agree. Carefully she loosened the thread. Inside were only two objects. A small brass workshop key, and a folded piece of paper no larger than a receipt. The key immediately caught my attention. I recognized it. It belonged to the side door of Thomas's workshop. The old door we had stopped using decades earlier after replacing the lock on the front entrance. I had completely forgotten it even existed. Elizabeth unfolded the note. It contained only one sentence. Some doors should remain unlocked. That was all. No explanation. No instructions. Just those 6 words. For a moment we both laughed. After everything, after hidden compartments, secret journals, years of promises, Thomas had left us one final lesson instead of one final mystery. Elizabeth looked toward me. I think I finally understand. So do I. The inheritance had never truly been the documents, or the trust, or even Samuel's estate. The inheritance had been trust itself, passed quietly from one honest person to another. Never forced, never demanded, only accepted. Elizabeth carefully closed the compass and placed every item back inside the cedar box exactly as Thomas had arranged them. Neither of us felt the need to hide them anymore. Their purpose had already been fulfilled. As the afternoon sun began sinking toward the horizon, we walked slowly through the community garden. She showed me tomatoes planted by local veterans, herbs grown by children recovering from long illnesses, raised beds maintained by widows who simply wanted somewhere to talk while pulling weeds together. This place reminds me of Thomas. Smiled. He would have loved it. He did. She looked at me. He volunteered here twice every month. I stopped walking. What? She nodded. He never wanted anyone to know. He repaired fences, built benches, fixed wheelchairs, sharpened garden tools, and every single time, he refused to let us thank him. That sounded so completely like my husband that I simply laughed through my tears. 4 years after his retirement, I had often wondered where he disappeared every other Thursday. Whenever I asked, he always smiled and answered, "I'm just helping an old friend." He never lied. He simply never explained. As evening approached, Elizabeth walked me back to my car. Before I left, she reached into her pocket and handed me the small brass key. "I think this belongs to you." I closed her fingers gently around it. "No, it belongs to the workshop." She looked confused, smiled. "Thomas left me one final instruction. He said the workshop should never become a museum. It should become useful again." Elizabeth looked toward the distant hills for several seconds. Then she smiled. "I know exactly what we should do." 3 months later, the repairs were finished. The old workshop stood straighter than it had in years. The broken roof had been replaced. The windows restored. The walls repainted. But inside, very little looked the same. Every Saturday morning, children gathered there to learn woodworking. Retired mechanics repaired bicycles free of charge. Young apprentices built birdhouses beside veterans who still remembered how. No one paid. No one charged. Everyone simply helped. Above the workbench, where the old toolbox had once rested alone, a simple wooden plaque now hung. Thomas never would have wanted his name carved into it. So we didn't. Does it? We used the words he had lived by every single day. Repair what you can. Keep your promises. Leave people better than you found them. Sometimes visitors ask who wrote those words. Elizabeth and I simply smile. We learned them. From two old friends. Thank you for spending this journey with me. If this story reminded you that the greatest inheritance is often trust, kindness, and the promises we choose to keep, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe. There are still many timeless stories waiting to be told.